Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Natural Super Kids podcast. I'm so excited that you are joining me today for this chat about managing tricky behaviours in children. I think we can all do with some tips and tricks and information about this. And joining me on the podcast today is the amazing Ashleigh Warner from Raising Humans Kind. Ashleigh is a psychologist. She's a gentle parenting advocate, and she is a mum of 2. So we talk about all things behaviour. She shares some of the key things that are important to know about our kids' behaviour. She tells us more about her 3 steps to managing tricky behaviour in kids, which is really practical, some real gold in there. And we just have a great chat about behaviour in kids and managing it in a really respectful way that doesn't damage attachment. So I'm thrilled to introduce you to Ashleigh. Welcome to the podcast, Ashleigh.
Thanks for having me here, Jessica. I'm excited to chat with you and talk about all of these things. Yes, so I'm Ashleigh. I am a family psychologist, and so I've been working as a psychologist for about a bit over a decade now. And I've got 2 boys. And once when I had my eldest son, who's 4 now, I just decided that I didn't really want to work I was working in trauma with kids who had some pretty significant trauma, and I was doing some play therapy and some family therapy. And I just felt like I wanted to be at home more with my babies. And I kind of thought, gosh, you know what I want to do? I really just want to teach people about respectful parenting. And then now I've created this way that I get to do that, which is just an absolute joy. So now I work with families all over the world and doing consultations and parenting work with them to support them on kind of implementing some more respectful parenting strategies and dealing with challenging behaviours in a more respectful, attachment-focused way.
Oh, I love that. And similar story to me. Like, I didn't want to kind of, when I had babies myself, I wanted to be at home more and didn't want to kind of be tied to that clinical practice. So started working online as well. So similarities there.
Yes.
So tell us, let's get started by maybe you explaining or telling the parents listening some of the key things that might be helpful for them to know about our kids' behaviour. I know that's a huge question.
Yes. I love these podcast questions that are just like huge.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and summarize it a little bit. So I guess what I talk to parents about in terms of behaviour is that behaviour is the symptom. So it's the thing that we see on the surface, and it's never the cause or the issue that we want to deal with. So when you look at a behaviour, it's important to look at the behaviour as like a red flag. Okay, so now I'm seeing hitting, or now I'm seeing pushing or pushback, or whatever it is that you're seeing. That is like the tip of the iceberg. And then where we really want to go and what we really want to understand is the cause, the why of that. So why is that happening? And that's where we want to spend our attention and our energy and our time as parents. Because if we just focus on the behavior, so the surface thing, let's say it's the hitting, then it's just going to pop up somewhere else. So if the hitting is being caused by frustration, if we don't actually deal with the frustration, but we manage to stop the hitting, it's just going to pop out somewhere else. And then we're just playing that whacking on top of symptoms type of issue, and it just doesn't get us anywhere. So I think probably the most important thing to understand about behaviour is that it is a symptom. And this deviates a lot from, most of us are pretty kind of conditioned to believe a very behaviourist approach to childhood, and the behaviourist approach has become, over the last 50 or 60 years, really solidified in our culture. And so we tend to see this idea of what becomes before and what comes after the behaviour as where we want to work, and that's actually not the case. And the more that we find out about it through neuroscience is the more we understand that emotions tend to drive behaviour, and there's always a cause, and dealing with the emotions and the cause underneath is going to be a lot more beneficial for us as families.
Yes, I love that explanation. And I think even for those of us who, have already heard this sort of thing or aware of it or read it or whatever, it's so good to be reminded of it, because it's so easy to forget that.
It is, isn't it? And I think, the thing that we do tend to forget is the majority of behaviour is simply a child's attempt at regulating the nervous system. So even if it is the pushing or the shoving or the fidgeting around, it's them trying to, their attempt to try and regulate the discomfort inside of themselves. And when we can remember that, and we can see we can have our lens with that in mind, we can often be less reactive and less frustrated, because we can see that they're just trying to manage that discomfort.
Yes. And as a mum of, new teenagers, I have a 14-year-old. This is so reassuring to remember.
Yes. And that's it. And it's the same for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're 2, 14 or 40. Often what we do is an attempt to regulate the distress within ourselves.
Yes, thank you. All right. So tell us more about your approach to discipline that doesn't damage attachment, because I know you're big on that.
Yes, I am. So attachment is kind of let me just clarify that attachment theory is not the same as attachment parenting. So I'm not necessarily talking about all of the things that often get, thrown into attachment parenting, but attachment science and attachment theory tells us that children want to be led by us. They want to look up to, they want to be similar to us. They want to take direction from us when they're strongly and deeply attached to us. And if we mess with that, if we kind of engage in discipline techniques that really damage that attachment, then we're really damaging the very thing that helps our children mature. And it's kind of a little dangerous game we're playing. And I think that in mainstream kind of parenting advice, we often get suggested to do these things that actually damage that attachment. So, for example, consequences, like I'm going to take, you've done something wrong, therefore I'm going to take away your iPad. It's really hard for a young child to want to depend on an adult who is looking around to try and find something that they love and remove it when they make a mistake. And if we don't have our children wanting to depend on us, then they're not going to deepen that attachment to us, and then they're not going to want to follow our direction, follow our lead, be similar to us. And that then just becomes really hard to parent them. So I guess what I talk about is just finding ways to manage challenging behaviour without damaging that relationship. And so instead of doing things like using consequences, it really is coming back to dealing with the cause of behaviour. So coming back to a lot of the work that I do in order to manage challenging behaviours is to do a lot of emotional regulation work. Because as I just said before, often the challenging behaviour is just the kid's attempt to regulate the distress. So if we can look underneath the behaviour and try and find out what the emotion is, so let's say, for example, it's frustration. So a child's hitting because they're frustrated. A frustration is the emotion that is something in my life is not working the way I want it to. So something's not happening in the way that I want it to. Now, for kids, that's so many different things. But in order to deal with the energy of frustration, it will come out in an attempt to change something, right? So a child's frustrated. They're trying to, let's say, change your mind. They want to have that last cookie and you've said no. So they might be flailing and hitting and kicking. They're frustrated. They're trying to change your mind. Once they get to the point where they've accepted that your no is a real no, what we ideally want is children then to find their sadness and their tears about that. And when they can release the sadness and tears out of their body, their brain actually moves into more of an acceptance state. and that energy, that state shifts. And so then we get a calmer, more connected child. So one of the most important ways that I deal with aggression in my work was helping a child find their tears of sadness. And when we can facilitate that process as parents, we can help our kids regulate their nervous systems and come back into balance. And when kids' nervous systems are back in balance, that's when you'll find much more connected, cooperative behavior.
Wow, that is really, really powerful. And I think probably our generation was parented, not to show the emotion. So that is often our natural kind of tendency, isn't it? That like as parents, because that's the way that we've been parented. Well, many of us have anyway. But emotion is a good thing when it comes to, discipline and managing kids' behavior.
It is exactly right. And I think this is the misunderstanding that we have because of the way that, the behaviorist model and things like that is that we think kids who cry over not getting the cookie that they wanted, or kids who find their tears because they're disappointed they lost a game, we see that as weak. And we see that as, when we don't have a resilient child, when it's the exact opposite. The child who can find their tears of sadness and tap into that vulnerability is going to be less aggressive and less attacking, and actually is going to be the very kid who grows up and can manage difficult emotions and difficult life experiences. So it's often counterintuitive for us because we've been so deeply conditioned to think that those children are, like I said, weak, when actually we really want to be facilitating that process, because it's one of the best natural ways that we have to rebalance kids and deal with challenging behavior.
Yeah, I love that. And that's so powerful. And I'm guessing, I think we've come a long way, but I'm also thinking as you're talking, like, that is especially true for boys still, I think, don't cry and all of that sort of thing. But we want to celebrate and actually, celebrate that emotion.
Exactly. And even even draw it out, even to the point where I say this to parents all the time. They'll come and they'll say to me like, oh, my child won't go to bed, or my child's, hitting their sibling. Okay, well, how often have they found, how recently and how often are they finding those tears of sadness? How often are they crying about the things that they can't change? Oh, no, never. They're just stuck in mad. Okay. So next time something comes up that's difficult for them or sad for them that they can't change, I want you to draw those tears out. Really try and press on that sadness. Really try and actually draw it out of them and see the more tears you can get. And every single time when a parent's able to do that, they'll come back and say, oh my gosh, she's sleeping again. Oh my gosh, he's stopped being so aggressive. Because it's actually, sometimes we need to really facilitate that process, and we really need to draw those tears out so that they can really have that opportunity to reset.
Yeah, it's the release. I mean, I think any of us listening know, how good it can feel after a good cry.
Absolutely.
So it's the same for our kids. I love that. Thank you for sharing. So can you maybe talk us through, in a practical sense, I think you've got a 3-step process to managing tricky behavior in kids.
Yes. So what often happens is that parents will get one point and they'll be like, oh, I'm holding really good boundaries, but the behavior is still happening. Or I'm not using consequences anymore, but now I don't know how to deal with this. So I've kind of broken it down for parents to say that there's almost 3 steps. So the first step is the here and now. So what do we do in the moment? This is where we need to hold the boundary and keep everybody safe. So if our child's hitting, for example, or doing something that's inappropriate, then it's our job to step in. And if we're talking about kids under 6 or 7, mostly our job is to step in physically. So it might be to stop a child physically hitting. We might need to physically pick them up and pull them away. Or whatever it is, it often requires a physical holding of that boundary, obviously done with respect and compassion, but what's important for parents to understand is that this is not verbal. We're not saying, can you please stop hitting? We're actually physically stepping in and stopping that from happening. So the first step is holding the boundary in the here and now. But what's really important for parents to understand, because often they start to follow respectful parenting and understand this idea of boundaries, but the boundary won't stop the behavior from happening again, because the boundary hasn't actually dealt with the cause of the behavior. So the boundary deals with the here and now. It steps in and says, I'm the parent and I'm going to keep everybody safe. That's my job. But it doesn't actually deal with the cause. So then step 2 is we need to look at, well, what's underneath that behavior? Why is it happening? And how can I deal with the cause? So let's say, for example, that it's an older sibling hitting a new baby, for example. So the first step would be we might need to step in and stop that from happening. But then the second step, we might need to think, okay, maybe that child's feeling a bit out of place. Maybe that child's feeling like their place in the family is a little bit lost. Maybe that child needs a little bit more connection. Maybe they're feeling like the baby's getting too much connection. So next time, I breastfeed, instead of trying to send the child away and distract them by giving them some toys to play with, I'm going to bring the child onto my knee and I'm going to read the child some books while I'm feeding the baby. So we're starting to deal with the cause of the hitting rather than just stopping the hitting in the moment. So that would be the step 2, is to deal with that cause of the behavior. So it might be emotional regulation, it might be connection, it might be hunger, right? Sometimes kids are simply hungry and so they act out. And so us dealing with the cause is making sure that they've had enough to eat.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, but I know personally, I find, more when there's challenging behavior with kids, more connection almost always works.
Yes. Connection or fresh air.
Yes. Fresh air too. That's a good one.
Fresh air. Yes. So connection's massive. I think it's one of the bigger drivers of challenging behavior is a lack of connection. Absolutely. So that's number 2. That's kind of dealing with the cause. And then the third step is then thinking about whether or not there needs to be a lesson. So often, again, we think, okay, well, if I'm not going to use rewards and consequences, I need to teach my child a lesson. And there's been some really wonderful reframes of discipline. Like I know Dan Siegel has talked about reframing the word discipline to mean to teach, which is a wonderful reframe. But I think the downside of that is that parents are misunderstanding that and thinking that they need to teach every single time there's a challenging behavior. And so they think, where's the lesson here? How do I teach the lesson? And so often I'll hear parents, having these really long conversations with their 2-year-old or their 4-year-old, and they're trying to explain something or ask them not to do it again or explain why it hurts. And really the lesson just isn't that helpful in that moment. So the lesson is best taught when the emotion is low and the connection is high. And that's never really in an incident. So we have the incident, which is, we need to hold the boundary. Then we want to deal with the cause. And then we want to come back later and if it feels appropriate, have a lesson, which for some children might be 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours later. It's rarely in the incident. And then the other thing I say to parents too is that sometimes the lesson's not even for the kids, it's for us. Sometimes the person who needs to learn the lesson is the parent, and it's just the lesson that says, okay, my child isn't capable of this in this season of life. My child is only capable of 1-hour play dates, or my child can't be in the sandpit when he hasn't napped, or my child actually can't be crawling around on the floor with their baby sibling in the afternoon. So sometimes the lesson is figuring out where our child's capabilities are in this season of life and accepting that and adjusting our parenting according to that. So often the lesson is really for us and not for them.
Yes, I love that. I think that'll be a big realization for lots of parents. And the fact that we don't always have to have a lesson. I think that sort of takes the pressure off as well.
Yeah. Yes. If you can deal with the cause of the behavior and hold the boundary, that's often enough, right? Because maturity is going to deal with most of this. If we can maintain our relationship with our kids and we can hold boundaries and we can support their emotional regulation, like maturity does so much of it. We just have to wait.
Yeah. So just a couple of questions on what you shared there. You said, for with the holding the boundary for kids sort of under 6 or 7, it almost always requires our sort of physical presence to hold that boundary. What about for older kids? Because this is something that I kind of struggle with now. My kids are older. Like, how, without stepping in physically, like, do you have any tips in that regard?
I probably need an example. I guess it would depend on kind of what's happening. Do you want to give me an example?
Well, yeah, say, so my 14-year-old can be quite physical, particularly like if he's been out with his mates and he comes home and he might be a bit rough with his sister. She's 12. So, but he's bigger than me now. So not that he's, aggressive or angry or anything like that, but now that he's getting bigger, it doesn't sort of seem appropriate to kind of step in physically. Is that enough of an example?
I guess what comes to mind there is then the importance of redirecting that energy. So I think sometimes we think we have to come in and stop it. But if you think about a child who's got, like, he's just come back, he's got all this beaming energy, what's a safe redirection for him to get that out? And so maybe it's just as a parent saying, look, I can't let you play with your sister right now because that doesn't seem safe. Let's go and throw the basketball together, or let's go and whatever it is. But I think if we come back to dealing with the cause, if we just try and stop him from playing with his sister, which it might be his attempt to release some of that extra energy, then he needs to be redirected in a safe way to do it rather than just stopping it.
Yeah, that's great. That's a perfect answer. I'm just thinking, I'm actually doing the right thing there because
perfect.
We'll often go out and do some basketball or do a bit of rough play, but even rough playing with him now.
Yes.
It's a bit of a dangerous
You're really
sport.
working at it. Yes.
I'll get his dad onto that job.
Yeah.
And then the other question that came up, was dealing with that underlying, the cause of the behaviour. What if we're not sure what the cause of the behaviour is?
I think I get this question a lot, and I think what I say to parents is really trust yourself, because I do think you do know. And you're not going to always get it right. Like, I don't always get it right. But every single time I have a consultation with families, not every single time, but the majority of the time, it's the parents that come up with the answer. Once we actually have the space to sit aside and go, oh, this behavior is like just popping up and popping up. Once I actually sit down with families and we spend, half an hour talking about it, they go, oh, it's X. And it rarely comes from me. So what I say to parents first is, if you actually just dedicate some time, whether you're talking to a partner or a friend or journaling in the evenings, if you set aside some time to really think it through, majority of the time you'll come up with the answer yourself. Because as the parent, you do know your child best. But then I would say it doesn't really matter if we exactly know. We're never going to know 100% of the time. We will get it wrong. I'm a psychologist. I still get to the point of the end of the day and say to my husband, wow, why is he doing that? Sometimes we're not going to know and we just do our best, or we just focus on, I think there's always things we can come back to, like emotional regulation and connection. If we're not really sure where it's coming from, we can just really go, okay, has my child had their tears lately? Have they moved enough energy? Are they getting enough exercise? Are they getting enough connection? And I think when we kind of come back to those three things, we can kind of deal with a lot of challenging behaviours.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And I think that's a really good point, to trust ourselves as parents. We're in that information age where we can, try and Google or read a book or to find the answer externally. But yeah, just sitting with ourselves, the answer will come up. So
it will. Yeah. And I think it's a real problem. Like, obviously I'm a psychologist and I share information on Instagram, so I'm definitely perpetuating that. But I do think it's a little bit of a problem with so much information, because we look outside of ourselves too much and we lose trust of our intuition. And the thing about attachment is, we need to be in that alpha role. So we need to be in the one that's leading. And if we're always looking up and trying to seek information from other people, then it's really hard for us to be the leader. So there's this really important, delicate balance where we want to shift what we know, and we want to shift the way we were treated and the last generation's kind of attempt at parenting, but not to the point where we're losing touch with our own intuition and our own knowledge of our own kids, because ultimately, as the parents, we do know our kids best.
Yeah, Definitely. I agree. Oh, so much great information. And I'm sure we could chat for a lot longer, but I know you've got a variety of different resources that will be helpful for parents. So can you tell our listeners a bit more about where they can find you and what you offer?
Sure. So I have the Raising Humans Kind podcast, which has just had one series where I interviewed 7 different people answering the questions, if we're going to drop rewards and consequences, what do we do instead? So in each interview, I go through a different element of conscious discipline that you can kind of try at home. Raising Humans Kind is where I am at Instagram, and I share lots of stuff there. Right now for this kind of month, I'm sharing lots of stuff about highly sensitive kids. And I have a membership. So if you've kind of got a kid where you're feeling like things are a little bit stuck and you're wanting a little bit more hand-holding and a little bit more support around implementing respectful parenting, that's the Raising Humans Collective. And I also do parent consultations as well. So that's where you can find me.
Lovely. You've got a lot going on, and we'll make sure we link to all of those things in the show notes. And I love your Instagram because I think it's really informative and educational and inspiring. So that's a great place for people to head. And I can't wait to listen to your podcast too.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Perfect. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.